our next speaker, panel leader, is a partner at Linklaters. She is a specialist in antitrust and foreign investment. She has over a decade in competition law in the UK and EU, and has worked on the Competition and Markets Authority. So please welcome Verity Egerton Doyle. Hi.
I'll leave it over to you. Hi everyone, and I'll welcome the two panelists up now and then introduce them. We're going to speak about regulation in exponential age, which I think is a great topic, and we have two brilliant speakers here to join me. So we have first Matthew Brauvac. Matthew is a director at the Digital Markets Unit, which is the not so new branch of the UK's Competition and Markets Authority, which is focused on digital markets, has been operating in shadow form for about 3 years now, and is very shortly, around the turn of the year, about to take on a whole swathe of new statutory powers to administer the UK's new regime for the largest tech companies, the strategic market status regime. And Matthew has a background as a competition and regulatory lawyer in telecoms, having been at Sky. I think you were at Vodafone before that, right, Matthew? So he has a broad range of experience that he brings to the role. Then just to my right, we have Ollie Bethel, who leads the competition team at Google for EMEA. Ollie has been at Google since 2008, and so has seen, I think we're going to kind of frame the panel. I'm going to step back in a moment and give you a bit of a framing for kind of how did we get to where we are, and I think it's great to have Ollie here because he's been at Google and kind of seen this whole evolution of the way that we've thought about regulating digital platforms, and in particular the market power of digital platforms. So welcome. So we have about 40 minutes, and we want to make sure we leave time for questions. So I think we'll probably each, I'll do a bit of scene setting, then I'll let Ollie and Matthew speak for a bit. We'll have a bit of a discussion, and then please do be ready to ask questions when we come to the end, and we'll make sure we leave time for that. But I mean, just to set the scene. So the von der Leyen Commission, the European Commission that is, just come to an end, but of course she's coming into her second term, which started about 4 years ago, introduced a whole swathe of new legislation relating to the digital sector. We're talking about around 20 new legislative instruments, and that's just the EU. If we go, outside the EU, in the UK has introduced a whole range of new legislation. The two most prominent pieces being the Online Safety Act, which passed Parliament last September, and the Digital Markets Competition and Consumers Act, which passed Parliament in May this year. We see the same thing all around the world. And this kind of complete tidal wave of regulation which has come in to address a range of perceived ills in the digital sector has really, just completely exploded over the last 5 years. And so how did we get here? And all of us here on this panel today are really people who focus on competition. And so I'll focus on the pieces of regulation that relate to market power and control of the most powerful tech companies, the most powerful platforms. But if we step back a bit, I think in our world, in our antitrust world, recognising that while live and breathe, it is a bit niche for most people. I think we started off, and Ollie, it'd be great to hear your observations on this. If we roll back kind of 10, 15 years, really the approach of competition authorities was, I think that the old adage was competition is just a click away. So when you think about digital markets, you think about online, and the example that was always given was MySpace. Everyone remember MySpace, or maybe you don't remember MySpace, but MySpace had such a leading position, and then competition was a click away. Facebook came, MySpace, young people today haven't even heard of it. And that was kind of really the mantra, I think, of competition authorities around the world for many years. And that led to a relatively hands-off approach. There are, of course, really, there are a number of big cases that are the exceptions to that rule. Of course, the very old Microsoft cases, there were some Google cases last decade, but they were kind of the exceptions to the rule. In general, competition authorities were not doing a lot of intervention in digital markets, and in particular in the merger control space. A lot of acquisitions took place. And I think then, it's probably starting about now 10 years ago, but really with a lot of momentum from about 7 or 8 years ago, there came a growing consensus that actually, hold on, what was the next Facebook that came to replace MySpace. And actually, now that we're looking at these digital platforms, a lot of them have had their market power for really quite a long time and have expanded that out into other areas. Of course, delivering new products and new services, often for free, to the citizens of the world. And so I think it was, around that time, around 10 or so years ago, but really with a lot of momentum in the 5 years after that, there was a real shift from competition authorities that started to think, actually, hold on, have we been, and I think there were allegations that perhaps they'd been asleep at the wheel. It's the role of competition authorities to stop, the accumulation and abuse of market power. And there was a concern that perhaps competition authorities had not done that. They hadn't been doing their job. And I think that led us into where I think we've been living for the last few years, which was really what I would like to call the age of remorse, where you then saw competition authorities coming and really using the full suite of their powers very aggressively against large technology companies. And at the same time, there's a debate around were the existing tools enough? And I think a consensus was reached certainly among authorities and among legislators that we did need some new tools, because actually these markets have different characteristics. Key among them, they're very, very fast moving. So one of the criticisms of antitrust is you have these cases that run on for 10 years and you might be trying to protect startups who, by the time the case finishes, they're dead. And so there was a consensus that we needed new tools, and that's kind of the context in which we have all this new regulation. And the key pieces being on the EU front, the Digital Markets Act, in the UK, the Digital Markets Competition and Consumers Act. And we're just now at a really exciting moment, I think, in the evolution of platform regulation, in that it was only in March of this year that the obligations in the Digital Markets Act started to apply. So we now have coming up to about 9 months. We're kind of coming to the end of the first year of the Digital Markets Act being fully in force. The UK's legislation is coming into force in, I think, December, January. And so we're now, having spoken about it for many, many years, I think we're now kind of on the edge of a new era of regulation of market power in platform markets. But, of course, at the same time, we've been having this debate, and, of course, technology, as we've been hearing, has moved on so rapidly. And so, it's kind of crazy to think that the Digital Markets Act, and we'll come in and talk about some of the differences between the different legislation and what that might mean for how fit they are for the future. But the Digital Markets Act, the text was settled at a time, before people were even really talking about large language models as something that was going to be widely available. And so then you have this problem where we've just got this shiny new, legislation, but then we start to ask the questions, is this fit for the future? Can this actually keep up with the fast pace of change? And so that's kind of that's where we are in our world, in the kind of antitrust and digital regulation world. And I want to come to Ollie first, because Ollie, you've been at Google a long time. You've seen this whole evolution from some of those exceptions to the rule, early cases that I mentioned, right through to now, where are we on the verge of big tech companies becoming regulated, just like telecoms or other forms of infrastructure? Ollie, what can you tell us about the journey you've been on and the moment you think we're in now?
That's a big question. Thank you for having me. Where to start? So I suppose that there are different types of remorse. You talk about an age of remorse leading to the formation of these new rules, and there are plenty of them for sure. But there's also another kind of remorse, which is that we have the new tools and we don't quite know whether they're fit for purpose or whether they're going to do what we hope that they would do. So I'd say that where we are now in the journey, from Google's perspective, is, I think some cautious optimism that these things are going to work and that there is a way to launch regulated products in a more scrutinized environment. There's certainly an acceptance at the company, and again, I can only speak for Google, but I think this applies across plenty of the gatekeepers, that with extensive reach, global reach, often across a portfolio of consumer-facing products, this kind of scrutiny, this kind of legislation was coming. The cases were taking a long time for a variety of reasons, but were taking a long time to work their way through the courts. You're not seeing very many of them. And that we would arrive at a destination where a regulator would expect to be, just as we present ourselves as wanting to be as nimble and innovative and fast-moving as the market demands, so too the regulator would want to be in that position. So I think there was for a long time a sense that we were moving in that direction. A lot has come all at once. I was previously EMEA, I'm now actually global, so I look across. No, it's fine, don't worry. The old days were simpler, and I think when you look across the global portfolio of work that my team is currently working on, all of these regulations are sort of moving in similar directions, but with some important differences in how they think about regulating technology companies. And at the same time, the narrow field in which I work, which is competition or antitrust, very much bleeds into other areas of regulatory interest. There is the blurring of 10 years ago is now sort of fully in effect. So privacy issues intersect with copyright issues, intersect with competition issues, sometimes at precisely the same moment. So there is a huge amount of complexity in the environment in which we find ourselves. As we look ahead, is that sort of the past, if you like, the getting through remorse and looking forward with a sense of sort of hope and optimism for how it can work, there are some aspects of this that we pay particular attention to at the moment. And I suppose you could sort of distinguish those between procedural areas where we have sort of hope and optimism, and then substantive areas. And when we talk about the procedural side of things, it was very interesting to me in those final remarks to hear something that I often hear within Google, within Alphabet, which is on the sort of the need for regulation to maintain enough flexibility, adaptability to function properly in the environment in which we're operating as we launch products. It's very much something we hear within the company from our engineering colleagues. However, at the same time, we're often asked for clarity and certainty. So there's a real tension there as regulators, and you see different approaches being taken internationally. We've talked a little bit about the DMU. Matthew's going to talk about the legislation in the UK. Do I codify a piece of legislation based on the products, the attributes, the launches that I'm seeing currently in the market? Do I define a search engine? Do I define a virtual assistant? Do I define a social network? Or do I try and build some adaptability into the system? And at the same time, I have people asking me for predictability. So it's an area where we pay a lot of attention. We hope for sort of some balancing between the two. You don't want to be caught by surprise with a piece of legislation that no one was prepared for, but at the same time, you want the regulator and the rules that they're applying to be adaptable enough to accommodate the products that you're launching. Proportionality, you'll often hear lawyers like me talking about that notion, but to be more specific, another thing that we look for now in this new regulated environment is a very clear sense of what the regulator's goals are and how we're going to be measured against those goals as kind of getting closer to a state of compliance that's satisfactory. I think sometimes, some of the notions that we talk about, perhaps not here so much, but in the sort of the small bubble of competition, you talk about notions of improving competition, of improving choice. But the fact is that manifests in product features and having a sense of what we are driving towards. There is a big difference, for example, to telling a search engine that it's important to promote choice, to give consumers an understanding of what's available and to allow them to make an informed decision, and mandating that traffic ought to go to particular websites. There's a big difference for us. Those things are both measurable. Which is it that we shoot for? So I think having some sense of where we're shooting for in the new framework is something that's also very important for us within Google. A little just perhaps on the sort of the substance of, in this age of hope, the substance of what we sort of hope to see. It may sound trite, but one of the things that we're often talking about within the company is, well, how does the regulator sort of pick the things in this dynamic, complicated, I mean, in the last hour, the changes that will be happening to Gemini will have been significant and multitudinous. In that environment, how are we choosing, and how is the regulator choosing the areas where we ought to focus? What really matters? We see, I watch with interest as the CMA hits some issues that people care a lot about. We talk about baby formula, we talk about dynamic pricing this morning, the Oasis tickets issue. You see the Competition Markets Authority really focusing on issues that consumers care about. How does that translate to our environment? How do we think about the areas where it's going to be really, really important? And both we and the authority will invest time and effort to understand the technology and ensure that we've created a good, noticeable, relevant outcome for consumers. That's very important. Second, how do we avoid going over old ground? As I say, a lot of these new pieces of legislation are truly international. I have regulators looking at ad tech in the US, in France, the European Commission, India, Korea. Everyone is looking at all of these issues. So there is a question, I think, for us and for the regulators that, well, okay, at what point do we sort of choose to move forward in a new area? Are we going to all be looking at the same issues in parallel for a long period of time, or are we going to have some regulators who are sort of pushing ahead in new areas, and what would ought those new areas to be? So that gives you a bit of a sense of what we're sort of thinking about within the company. To end on a sort of, perhaps a sort of somewhat less optimistic note, I think there is a bit of a risk, particularly in Europe at the moment, as we see some of these intersecting pieces of legislation and the complexity. The DMA, the Digital Markets Act, is 22 rules. We have 8 core platform services that have to comply with those 22 rules, and we're just one gatekeeper. When you look at the nature of those rules and regulations that you must comply with, an easy default in the short term is not to launch. And I think that's something that people should be aware of, right? It's not born of any desire to make great pronouncements about a desire to sort of pull back launches to make an impression. It's just a fact of resource allocation within the company. And that is something that we see increasingly, I think, in certain areas. I think we're in my segue to Matthew, we're optimistic that the UK's framework gives you more space, more ability to be nimble and adaptable and to sort of take a somewhat simpler approach. But it is one of those substantive risks that we see out there ahead of us in the European Union.
Matthew, response, or could you give us a bit of, I mean, in particular on this last point around, I think many people here, we saw in the survey at the beginning, are looking at bringing, new technologies to market, and obviously not everyone is Google or another large platform, but this question of how do you ensure that, as we move to more of a regulated kind of environment, including for the largest tech companies who are obviously key counterparts to people looking to launch new products, how do we ensure that in the UK, from your perspective, customers are still and citizens are still getting access to kind of new technologies, and how can we do that in a way that kind of protects competition and contestability and over the longer term, but at the same time doesn't leave us behind? Small job.
Yeah, thanks for that. So thanks very much. Very glad to be here. Thanks also to Ollie for giving us a sense of perspective in your comments. Ollie, I can tell you that as important as the issues are that we're talking about today, the UK public cares about their pets far more than any of these issues. We've had more responses to our current inquiry into vet services than kind of all of the other inquiries that we've got going on combined. So worth keeping in mind. Look, I think a couple of things. I would say it's important we start from a pro-digital markets, pro-platform businesses standpoint, and it's worth sort of saying that always up front. We've got 3 lawyers on the stage here. When I was a lawyer in private practice many years ago, what the partner said to me, we train lawyers like we would train doctors if we ever only showed them corpses, because basically lawyers learn by case law of things going wrong. You pretty much do all of your work on things that go wrong. And I guess the same is true of regulators, right? Regulators tend to think about the risks first and the benefits second. And I think we need to be balanced about that. So we start from a position, digital markets have brought amazing benefits to consumers, to business, to the economy. The UK economy is a highly digital economy, probably the third largest digital economy in the world. And we have got amazing innovation here in the UK. So, it's kind of worth sort of starting with that. For those who haven't necessarily been following every bit of the legislative proposals that have been running, as Verity says, for some time here in the UK, we are just about to, to launch with the new powers that we've got to regulate digital markets. And they are similar to the EU Digital Markets Act in their sort of overall, high-level purposes. But they're quite different in a couple of sort of key points, which I just want to quickly touch on. One is the Digital Markets Act, the rules are there codified actually in the legislation, and also a lot of the thresholds in order to kind of know whether you're in or out are also codified. So it gives quite a bit of legal certainty, but as Ollie said, it doesn't give you a lot of flexibility or a lot of nimbleness. Now, in the UK environment, we're going to go the other way on that. We're more flexible, but recognize that means that you can't be quite as categoric about, exactly what applies and exactly when. So we will be in a position to apply the new rules. There are some thresholds which show that it really should only apply to the very largest companies. You have to have really quite significant turnover in the UK or globally in order to apply. And then, frankly, for reasons of resource, I can reassure people around the room that we really are just looking at the very largest tech companies that have got, as Verity mentioned, strategic market status, a position of strategic significance. There are some sort of qualitative tests that we need to go through there, and then most importantly, nothing happens automatically. We have to start the process by actually putting out an analysis and run a 9-month process of actually analyzing the market power. We analyze market power, we give an opportunity for gatekeepers, other stakeholders, lots of people to comment. That'll be a very transparent and open process, and it'll be evidence-led and evidence-based. And then, to Ollie's point, we also have the advantage that we will set out in that process what are the purposes for which we think we're intervening. Is it to increase choice? Are we trying to improve competition in the core product itself that we've got? Or are we mainly trying to prevent leveraging from that market power into adjacent markets? Or are we trying to intervene in order to mitigate the effects of that market power directly on consumers and businesses today? And it may well be a mixture of those things, but it is an obligation on us to set that out clearly. And then when we look at the interventions that we're going to do, we have to decide, are they going to be effective as against that purpose that we've set? And then, are they proportionate? And that test will be set out. So we do have one advantage that kind of unlike the Digital Markets Act, we don't have to have a single answer to Ollie's question. We can have different answers for different digital markets and different sectors. And I think that that's probably right, because actually we, to the comment of the previous speakers about, using the term vehicle to mean 3 different things. Actually, the term digital markets actually encompasses really some quite different sectors that have got really quite different dynamics. And some companies are challengers in one and incumbents in others. And, that is going to be part of the interest going forward. So the final thing I'd like to say is, I completely agree with Verity. It's a really interesting time. It's an interesting time because it's also going to be a time of a natural experiment. We're going to see how the Digital Markets Act applies. We're going to see how antitrust enforcement, which is typically the way that the US is leading things, applies. And we're going to see how the DMCC Act in the UK applies. And I absolutely agree. We're going to have to keep good records of, the kind of KPIs and the outturns that we get from those different approaches. And frankly, if we see good results in some places, we will adapt in order to, benefit from that learning. And that is absolutely part of the approach that we're taking and the way that we're thinking about it. Final point is it's really important, the people have commented about how fast moving these markets are, how technologically complex they are. We absolutely recognize that challenge. CMA was one of the first sort of authorities out there to really invest in data science, in data teams. We've now got about 80 people in our data unit with technologists, that sort of background. We're never going to become a Google, but that's fine because, that's not our job. But we have got that expertise, and I think we'll continue to develop it. Similarly, in our digital markets unit, we're now up to about 75 people, working and thinking very hard about these issues, and I think being, really up to date on how the issues develop is super important. It was mentioned in the previous panel, some reports that we've put out recently on foundation models and AI, and I think sometimes it can be overlooked just how important it is for an authority like the CMA just to put that kind of information into the public domain, both for its own benefit and also for the benefit of people all the way around the ecosystem. So I think we'll try to do more of that in addition to exercising the new powers when, as Verity says, they should come online in January of next year.
So we've got, I think you've set this up very nicely, Matthew, because we've got kind of in our antitrust bubble, digital platform regulation world, we do have this really kind of interesting natural experiment that is running, looking at the different models. But of course, that occurs in the context of, the much broader context that we heard about on the earlier panel and in the earlier discussions around, the need to build out a digital infrastructure, international competitiveness and competitiveness of different economies around the world, which will be so dependent on having access to access to essentially compute capacity and everything that you need to do that. And so in the last few weeks, obviously there's a new government in the US, or soon to be a new government in the US. We have a relatively new government here, and in the last few weeks, the Prime Minister has made a lot of statements around growth and around making sure regulators don't get in the way of growth. And then if you think about the EU side of things, the new Commission very focused on energy, climate change, but also in the context of, some of you may have heard of the Draghi report, which is a report that's come out talking about the competitiveness of Europe and talking about European industrial strategy and how these different areas of regulation might intersect with that, and how we might need, in some cases, very, very aggressive enforcement, but in other cases, a bit more flexibility to ensure that, on a broader stage, Europe has its own champions, Europe is competitive, and similarly here in the UK, ensure that we have the right digital infrastructure here in the UK. Ollie, you mentioned that, increasingly for you're seeing the intersection of a number of different areas of regulation. How does Google see the kind of your slice of regulation that you own in that broader context, in that thinking about the competitiveness of different economies and what we need for the for the digital future?
So it's a big question. It's certainly true that as we you sort of feel a pull in different directions. On the one hand, there is the pull which is sort of driven by the markets in which we operate, and which is manifest from what you're seeing being launched and the speed at which you're seeing it launched, which led to be out there bringing new products to market. I mean, it's you made the point in your opening remarks, Verity, about the risks of codifying some of these services and looking to a sort of a world before to define the regulation thereafter. And certainly in search, I can tell you here today that I've never seen the degree of competition that our search teams feel at the moment as intense as white heat as it currently is. You look across different types of search queries, different places in which ChatGPT, Perplexity, these engines are a real threat to Google and its search business. So I think you feel that, and from a competition law perspective, it's fantastic, of course, to see that and be able to talk about that. But you very much see that pull to launch and to be out there. At the same time, you sort of feel this call to be part of a drive to ensure competitiveness, both at the firm level in the products that we bring to market, at the national level in the ways in which we compete within one market, and then at the supranational level if you're competing in the European Union. So a real exhortation to ensure that you're pushing forwards, you're bringing those products to market, you're doing everything you can to build out the platforms. There's also these rules. As Matthew says, their starting point is that these are big, important platforms. But at the same time, you want the big, important platforms to continue to expand, to innovate, because by their very nature, they're a platform for other people to compete also. So there's really that pull to do everything we've been doing before, but much faster. Whether it's the call to competitiveness, whether it's the call of our sort of the business environment to bring products to market. But as I say, at the same time, dealing with the fact that there is an annoying competition lawyer called Ollie sitting in London saying, look, I've got a report, there's an Article 11 report I've got to deliver to the European Commission, and I have to explain how we have complied with these codes, with these definitions, and that's something that you're going to have to spend this amount of your week working on. And for those of you who are working with engineers, right, that time, the working week is very much segmented into 30-minute blocks of coding time, and I need that time to now talk to a regulator and explain how this particular product complies with a law that may well have been drafted based on sort of 3 or 4 iterations previous of what you're currently working on. So there is that very much that tension as we try and think about the various demands of the market and regulation. At the same time, I do think that people are sort of using their imagination for how some of these processes have the potential to actually sort of incorporate themselves within launch calendars, within the product design process. And therein, I think, lies the opportunity. As Matthew says, if within an agency there are people who speak the same language as our engineers, who are cognizant of the drag that it is to have to come and talk about this stuff, who can very quickly get to the nub of an issue without requiring hours and hours of education, can speak in a language that the engineer understands when talking about solutioning and the options for bringing yourself quickly into compliance so that you can keep moving. I think there are opportunities for that, and I think that really is for me and my team, that's where we're really trying to shift the nature of the regulatory debates within the company and externally, away from an environment where engineers feel like they have to sort of come away and do some homework with us that seems rather irrelevant to their day-to-day, to actually seeing it as an opportunity to get a bit of a sense check from people who also understand the products and the environment in which we're operating, and are really selling not the gold star of well done, you're in compliance, but the gold star of you have listened to this market, you have listened to someone informed, someone technical, someone who understands what you're trying to achieve, and you're more competitive for it. So I think that's the sort of the goal that we shoot for.
Matthew?
Look, I think it is a challenge. I think it's a challenge on both sides. I think regulators and agencies need to start a bit humble, and need to make sure that we kind of come back to that and recognize that. Probably also really focus on the biggest issues. This can get to be a bit of a laundry list, and some of the challenges I think are going to be trying to really be quite firm on that, actually, because there will be a lot of concerns that get raised. Some of them are super important. Many of them will be super important to the people raising them, but that's not really the test that we're applying. The question is, are they super important to the process of competition itself? I think we're going to have to be strong in some ways. As long as we're being criticized from all sides, we're probably about right. That's kind of the regulator's goal. And we'll see how that goes. And again, I think we'll have to adapt as we go along, and as we see the results coming out, as I said, from this kind of natural experiment, I think we'll have to be willing to change course. That's what companies in this space do all the time. So definitely want to see large platforms continue to innovate, but equally also want to make sure that we're creating the space for smaller players also to innovate, if you like. You know, this should be a dynamic, competitive process. I think there are some commentators who have said that, you know, it's not been as dynamic in the last 10 or 15 years as it was in 10 or 15 years prior to that. And I think that's what we're really, you know, that's the gold star. Greater dynamism in these areas.
I mean, I could go on with more questions for a long time, but I did promise time for questions from the floor. So are there any questions from the audience? Yeah. I think there's a microphone coming for you.
I want to apologise to Mr. Google before I ask the question, but it is fundamental to the argument, I think, is that Google's business model has been search engine optimization, which is advertising fundamentally, whereas your competitors are looking at it a paid-to-use or paid-to-search environment. Do you think a company like Google, and you probably won't want to answer this question, can change its business model to meet the needs of the market today?
Can I suggest we take this question as well, just while answer that, but hear them both together in case there's overlap.
Thank you very much. My question is rather for Matthew. It's about adjacent markets and the AI impact to markets which are not the core digital market but others. I have two examples from the US, both of them. The 6-month strike in Hollywood, which was motivated by AI concerns of the writers and actors. No movie produced. So there was a freeze in Hollywood. It was caused by concerns on AI use forms. And the second one, still in the US, is the Ohio Power versus large suppliers of digital and AI. You probably know about this lawsuit, which is basically about the concern that with a market power allowing them to buy a lot of electricity, they might disturb the pricing strategy for retail consumers and have the bills of the poor consumers go very high up because people can't face and compete with large companies when it comes to buying electricity in some context.
Those are two quite separate questions. Ollie,
I'm happy
to
to take the first. I think it's a very interesting question, thank you. So you're quite right, of course, that for the search business, search advertising has absolutely been the form of monetization. Around that, in the portfolio of Alphabet products, of course, we take different approaches to monetization. You have revenue shares in Play, you have subscription models in YouTube. So there are a variety of different ways of thinking of monetizing products. And as we consider how we can compete in the new forms of sort of agentive search, if you want to call it that, then I think there has to be an open-mindedness to how you would monetize. I will say this, I think that, you know, one of the things that was quite remarkable to me when I started at Google was that it was always very hard, if not impossible, to get the ads team and the search team to be in the same conversation. Because the way that Google thought about it then and continues to think about it now is that the search team needs to ensure that we have attention through relevant search results. When you've done that, enter ads in the case of search. So I think that core proposition of starting with the product that's going to attract attention because it provides a relevant output, whether that's an agentive response, whether it's, you know, booking a hotel for me or whatever it happens to be, will be something that you will see in common with the new areas that we're moving into. This is very much a personal perspective. I can't speak to sort of the monetization plans for Google in generative AI in the round, but it is quite interesting to me as you see something of a form of competition in the monetization models that various are approaching. Subscription models with ChatGPT, Gemini has an advanced subscription model now, and quite how things evolve will be really interesting to observe. You know, one final thought on this is that in a multimodal world, it has always struck me as a very interesting problem to think of, where you've been very used to sort of show an ad at this point and a click generates revenue. How do you start to think about monetization models in that new environment is very much an open question. But thank you for that, I appreciate it.
If I could just follow up on that one, I would say, you know, we would like to see a diversity of business models. So, you know, I don't think it's everybody switching from one to another, but actually if you know, that could well be one of the sort of KPIs that you sort of look for, if you like, right? To this gentleman's question, the digital markets regime is a sectoral regime. So we are thinking kind of vertically rather than horizontally across the entire economy, like antitrust does. So therefore, whilst there are provisions in the Act to allow us to set rules in relation to sectors where the company doesn't have market power, if they're doing things in a way to reinforce their market power, we can do that. However, the kinds of examples that you've given, I think, are, to be honest, a long way from the sorts of things that we're thinking about. I mean, that's quite a stretch, out into thinking about actors or writers in Hollywood writing rooms, that sort of thing. It's much more likely that they're going to be adjacent digital markets, and you're thinking about, if you like, these newer areas that might have some link into the digital activity in the first place. So I think certainly that's where our focus is going to be.
All right. I can see we've just hit zero seconds remaining. So I think that is a good point to wrap up and let people have coffee. Thank you very much, Matthew, Ollie. Thank you for the questions and for listening.